Testing. Good evening. I'm Paul Fredette.
And I'm Karen Fredette.
Together, Karen and I have been ministering to hermits and to religious solitaries around the world now for nearly 18 years through Ravenspread Ministries, right here from our home in the mountains of western North Carolina. And in March of this past year, we received a very gracious invitation from Brother Sean Bradley to participate in the efforts of the Interfaith Franciscan community by offering weekly presentations here on the Doves for Peace channel. It's been our privilege and our pleasure to be with you on such a regular basis since late March. Most recently, we've been retelling the story of a very fascinating and courageous woman of the 13th century, Clare of Assisi, who really is a model for all of us in the 21st century.
Yes.
Before Karen and I ministered to hermits, Karen spent over 30 years as a member of the Order of Poor Clares in the monastery of Santa Clara in Canton, Ohio. And while she was there, she spent 10 years, right, Karen?
Counting all the research, yes, 10 years.
10 years researching the life and the times of the foundress of the Poor Clares, who was born Chiara di Favarone di Offerduccio, known in history as Clare of Assisi, the first female follower of Francis Bernardoni, who is known to history as Francis of Assisi, and who, perhaps more than any other human being, incorporated within her life, her persona, and everything about her, the ideals, the message, and the values that moved Francis of Assisi. She, more than anyone else, kept the flame of Francis's ideals, of the spirit that Francis brought to the church and to the world, even and perhaps more after his death. She was the one who most faithfully safeguarded this. She was a very brave woman, a very courageous woman, a woman who really went against a lot of the accepted protocols and conventions of her day. And when we left off the story last week, she had just taken her vows as a religious before Francis in the very tiny little church called St. Mary of the Angels, known as the Porzioncula, the little portion, a tiny chapel that lay on the plain below the hill, below the city of Assisi, a small chapel that Francis had literally rebuilt and refurbished. And when we ended our account last week, her servant, really, she was a noblewoman, as you recall, but her friend and companion and servant person, her, what do you call her, a duenna?
Her duenna, her chaperone.
Pacifica Guelfuccio, took up her festive clothing and the shorn locks of her hair, and returned home to Assisi, while Francis himself and a few of the friars escorted her to the Benedictine monastery of San Paolo in Bastia, which was just about an hour's walk from the little chapel of St. Mary of the Angels. They went there, no doubt, due to the advice and the guidance of Bishop Guido, the Bishop of Assisi, because the monastery, the Benedictine monastery of San Paolo, enjoyed special papal protection from intrusion or molestation of the sisters, which it was fortuitous that this decision was made, wasn't it, Karen?
Well, yes.
Because Clare's family, especially her uncles, led by the leader of the Offerduccio clan, Uncle Monaldo, really were enraged by this and took it upon themselves to actually invade that monastery, despite the papal protections that it enjoyed, tearing down the doors of the monastery and armed men on horseback invading the monastery. Now, in our introduction to the whole story of Clare, we went over what happened there. They failed in their attempt to retrieve Clare and bring her home, but it was apparent both to the abbess and to the bishop and to Francis himself that this situation was not going to work out the way they anticipated. And so not long after Clare was there, perhaps maybe a week to 10 days, Francis escorted her to a much different place. This was a very stable, very staid Benedictine monastery, very highly structured, with an abbess and just the whole works, you know. And he took her up the mountain, up Mount Subasio, and he took her to a small, rather informal community of female recluses at San Angelo de Panzo, which was perhaps the opposite of what the Benedictine convent, the Benedictine monastery.
It was quite a different setup. You know, they were sort of beguines. They were women, many widows, living a sort of loose community life, more hermit life than group community life. But they didn't have walls. They didn't have big protections.
They had, you know, small enclosures and things like that, but things that were structures that were easily penetrated and invaded. And while she was, and so Francis brought Clare there to spend some time there. And it was relatively inaccessible, relatively hidden, but, as Karen says, relatively unprotected and indefensible as well. While Clare was there, her younger sister, Agnes, whom she had grown up with and was very close to, they were soulmates, they were just two totally bonded individuals. And the pain of that separation must have been so great for both of them anyways. However, we don't have really the details of how it happened, but Agnes came to her at San Angelo.
Yes.
And while Agnes was there, the uncles returned again with the intent, this time with a little bit more finesse, hoping to kind of putting people off their guard by saying they had just come to talk and everything else. But their real intent was to retrieve not only Agnes, but also Clare as well. Well, when they decided to really make their move on Agnes, Agnes fell to the ground, and in a very miraculous sort of way, she became so heavy, she was unable to be lifted from the ground, and despite all of these burly knights on horseback and with arms and everything else, they were unable to pick up Agnes and physically remove her from that spot. And so Agnes remained, and so did Clare, and the uncles went off frustrated, but defeated.
Well,
really,
yes.
At least for the time being, they went off quite defeated. Well, for whatever reasons, and again, we really don't know the details, but we do know that Clare was not satisfied with where she was in that place. It was not the place that she felt she really belonged in.
Her first biographer put it this way. He said, her soul was not at rest.
Okay, that's a good way of putting it. Her soul was not at rest. And so not long after, we're talking maybe
A few
another
weeks.
another few weeks at most, Francis finally feels, and apparently with the blessing of Bishop Guido, and apparently with a lot of work and help from the rest of the friars, feels that the preparations are complete, and he goes, and probably in the company of either Brother Philip or a few of the other friars, and escorts Clare and Agnes from San Angelo to where their home is to be, San Damiano. The chapel of San Damiano, where Francis first had his experience of conversion, and where now he brings Clare, and where Clare, and show you again, just to help visualize this, a picture of Clare. This is taken, this is a portrait done by...
It was a photograph of her, and she was about 40, I think.
Yeah, a photograph. Yeah, a painting of her when she was about 40. But anyways...
not very flattering, actually.
But she was brought there to San Damiano, which is the way we began retelling this story. San Damiano was to become her home for the next 42 years. She was not to leave San Damiano. It was, in a sense, to become the hearth of the Franciscan family, and Clare herself was to be the flame in that hearth.
Yes.
Karen?
She, there at San Damiano, Clare kept alive the dream and the ideals of Francis when even the friars were in disarray about what to do after Francis died in 1226. I visited San Damiano. It was a great dream of mine. It was something that happened only after I wrote the book. And I'd like to take you a sort of through a walkthrough.
Right, and we do this for you this evening because San Damiano is so much, it was the place that became so much the hearth of the Franciscan life, as we say, and was the home of Clare. It was her enclosure, her monastery, her life for the rest of her life. And so we would like you to be at least a little bit familiar with the way the monastery and the church must have looked and appeared a little bit to her.
What we see in front of us right now is the facade. Directly behind the arcades is the Church of San Damiano. You would go down a few steps below into the church itself. And that was the church. This was the building that Francis himself rebuilt. And
again,
if you look
Karen,
closely...
Again, Karen, right. I guess we were both going to say the same thing. If you look closely, and I'll try to move the arrow here, there's a section of this area here that is darker stone. And this part here, which travels along where the arrow was, is the original structure of the building. This lighter stone was where the building was enlarged later on.
Yes. So Francis takes Clare and into the chapel where the crucifix of San Damiano, as it is called, has been preserved. It was the crucifix that gave him the first inkling of what his vocation was meant to be, where he heard the voice speaking to him, saying, "Francis, go rebuild my church, which, as you see, is falling into ruin."
This was the image of the crucified Lord that Clare fell in love with. This was the symbol of that spiritual marriage. Remember, we're talking the Middle Ages right now. We're talking about the spirit of knighthood and chivalry and romantic love in its and the whole thematics, the whole metaphors of espousal and romantic love are flowering in this way. And this is elevated to a spiritual realm where Clare really is brings to the Lord, brings to the crucified Christ her love, and she brings, her virginity, her chastity. She brings that to the Lord. This is an espousal. This is a spiritual marriage. And she is alive. She is aflame with love for Jesus Christ. This and as he is imaged in this, what we have come to know in history as the San Damiano cross.
Francis called himself the bridesman of Christ. In our today's language, we would say the best man.
Mm-hmm.
And he brought the bride to Christ at the chapel of San Damiano. And Clare would pray before this crucifix daily for the rest of her life. And she wrote of what Francis gave her at this moment. She wrote, "The Son of God became for us the way, and that way our Blessed Father Francis, his true lover and imitator, has shown and taught us by work and example."
Right. And let's be clear about this right now. As we look at this whole structure, both exterior and interior, we have to remember that Clare came to San Damiano, although the daughter of nobility. She did not own San Damiano. She did not possess San Damiano. San Damiano, the church, the monastery, all of whatever that property encompassed, belonged to Bishop Guido of Assisi, and it was on loan to the poor ladies. And we might want to just backtrack for a moment and just say, it's important to say at this point, that by the time Clare and Agnes had arrived at San Damiano, while they were still at San Angelo de Panzo, at that loose community of recluses up in the mountains, Clare had disposed of her dowry. Her dowry as a noblewoman would have been all of the property, any of the jewels, the precious gems, or other articles of the household and family that were given to her as part of her dowry. Very little coin, because in those days the whole idea of coinage was still just starting up. So there would have been very little money, but there would have been a lot of land and property and perhaps buildings, estates that belonged to this family that would have been part of Clare's dowry, as well as precious gems and artifacts from the household that were worth a lot of money. She took that money, and rather than sell it back to members of the family.
Yes, and they offered to buy it back when they heard that she was going to dispose of it, because they didn't want to break up the family's holdings. It was important to them.
Right. Clare's dowry was completely sold, but not to her family members, who, as Karen was just saying, would have loved to have bought it back from her. But rather, Clare sold the proceeds to the poor. And so combine not only the gospel injunction, but really with a mind towards what perhaps today in our mindset we would look at as social justice.
Yes.
Because part of the reason that the poor the serfs, the peasants, were kept forever in their state of poverty and serfdom, and was the fact that they owned no land. There was no way for them to grow their own food. There was no way for them to prosper at all. So if she had land, she sold it to the poor so that they could better themselves. And so this was very much as it was a commitment to evangelical poverty, it was also a commitment to social justice in her day. A truly beautiful example, and perhaps one that was rather unrivaled in her time for that kind of gesture, that kind of totally radical social action on the part of an unmarried woman.
It was a main rule of both Francis and Clare that anybody who wanted to join them had to, quote, go sell what they have and give it to the poor, and then come follow me. And I think this was also a way of sorting out the merely curious from the serious followers of Jesus. So Clare came, but she did bring a dowry. And Pope Innocent IV, at the time of her canonization, said she brought two things as her dowry to Jesus. One was her dedication to Lady Poverty, and the second was her vow of chastity.
And for the remainder of her life, she really believed and she really lived in a very genuine way that total commitment, that absolute commitment, the gift of total, not mitigated in any form, but total poverty and complete chastity to the Lord Jesus.
Now, we brought Clare to the Church of San Damiano, and we're going to take you through a little walkthrough of the building as it now exists. Certain portions of it have been maintained by the friars, as they were in the 13th century when Clare and her sisters were living there. So there are the doorways, it was a stone building and it had wooden doorways, and many of them had arched lintels. And if that doorway looks somewhat low to you, it is. I realized as I walked through San Damiano that those doorways were built for people who did not grow as tall as we do today.
Did you have to duck?
No, I was able to walk through, but I could
just barely.
Just barely, yes. And if you will notice, what you are walking on is a stone floor. This is a stone building. And I was quite fascinated with the stone floors and the stone stairways in this building because I knew that the sisters were barefoot. It made my own toes curl up a little bit to imagine them in the wintertime walking on this stone floor. I thought about that, and I thought possibly in certain areas they may have been able to put down some straw mats in the winter. I'm not sure. But what you're looking at now is a stairwell. You're looking down towards the vestibule that's directly off of the Church of San Damiano itself. And in that area is a small alcove, it's not visible in this picture, where when Francis was rebuilding the church, he hid when he heard his father had come looking for him. He hadn't yet reached that state of complete trust in the Lord. So when his father came storming out, he hid in this little alcove. This doorway leads directly into a portion of the choir, the place where the sisters prayed the Liturgy of the Hours, as we would call it today, or the Divine Office. And these pictures make it look larger than it really is. When I looked into it, and you weren't allowed to walk directly in because they're protecting this ancient wood. It looks like maybe 6, possibly a few more women could be in there to pray. And when you think that they prayed the night office, when it would be pitch dark, only one small oil lamp would have been on that little lectern that you can see in the far corner, and that would have been for the use of the reader who would be doing the readings for the day. The nuns themselves would have been praying the Psalms in Latin by heart.
Mm-hmm.
This was not uncommon, that they recited everything by heart. What you see here is when you go up that stairwell, there halfway up is this little room which is known as Clare's oratory. Now you see a lot of frescoes there, which I'm quite positive were not there in the time of Clare, because they're pictures of Clare.
Right.
And I cannot imagine her praying in this little oratory with pictures of herself painted on the wall. But they are very ancient pictures, and they do show Clare clothed probably much like she really was at that time.
Karen, why don't you tell our listeners and our viewers about this little area right here, which in their view is just to the left of the altar. It looks to you in your viewers as a kind of a dark spot in the wall over here.
Yeah, that was a little alcove where the pyx with the Blessed Sacrament was kept. And this little chapel was a favorite place for Clare to pray, especially during the night. And at one point, she dedicated it to Our Lady when Francis gained what is known as the Great Pardon. He gained it for Our Lady of the Angels. And we'll explain more about that when the time comes.
Right. Let's continue the tour here.
On your right, as you were going up the steps, I could look out a little window, and there was a little balcony with some flowers planted, and this was known as Clare's garden. And this is where she would often sit and do her sewing. She was able to look out over the Spoleto Valley,
which you can see over here. The blue area is looking out over a valley. We'll move to another picture over here, which is a close-up, and maybe you can see a little bit more. We don't think so, but perhaps you can see just a little bit more. Out here, she would have looked over. This is the edge of the balcony with these flowers, and if you look in this area, there were the fields and the trees. And what would she have been looking out on, Karen?
Well, she was the Spoleto Valley. The Tiber River ran through that valley, and also the road that led to Rome. So, and they also had fields, vineyards, olive groves.
All right, olive groves, right. That was my cue, olive groves.
Yes, here come the olive groves.
And these are actual olive groves right from that same general area in Assisi. And these might have been the kinds of sites that might have been very common for Clare and her sisters to have seen in the immediate environment of San Damiano.
I walked by that particular olive grove, and it was really opened my eyes to what they are truly like. So Clare would sit in this sunny little balcony, working, doing her sewing and her working, and then the same stairwell would lead you up to the dormitory, and the stairwell is coming up right through here. You can see there's a little banister that's put there now. I don't know if it was there in the sisters' time, but you came up the steps right in this area. And in this corner was where Clare had her pallet. And the dormitory, as it exists now, could possibly have allowed 12 women on pallets on the floor. Now, we know that there were more than 12 there, and at one point, when Clare was there may have been as many as 50. So a part of this long room has obviously been walled off. When Clare first moved in with Agnes, she was very, very penitential. And for her mattress, she chose dried twigs, vine twigs, and a stone from the riverbed for her pillow. She was very hard on herself, but very easy on the sisters, and would actually forbid them to do some of the penances that she did. She wore at one point early on a garment made of boar's hide, which had the rough side against her skin.
The
underneath
bristles?
her, the bristles, yes. It makes me uncomfortable just to think of it. And when one of the sisters, I think it was her own sister Agnes, finally got on her case about that, she changed it to what they called a cilice of horsehair. Probably not a great improvement. But she tried to keep this hidden from the other sisters. But when you think of all these women living close together, sleeping side by side, there was very little that you could keep hidden. And one of the youngsters, who joined as a child, in fact, her name was also Agnes, was so fascinated by this cilice of horsehair that she wanted to try it. So Clare said, all right, you can try it. And she gave it to the young woman. And it said that within 3 days, little Agnes gave it back to Clare more cheerfully than she had received it from her. This is the corner of the dormitory where Clare died. Usually there is a pot of flowers there that the friars put down every day. The friars now take care of San Damiano, and they live there also. As you leave the dormitory, you'll come out a doorway and you will see the church bell, which is hung between the dormitory and the another building that had been added on since Clare's time. But you go down the steps below this bell and you come into the courtyard. Now this is a picture probably taken from the dormitory, looking down into the courtyard. And what is in the center of the courtyard is the well, which was practically a luxury in those days, for the sisters to have their own well of fresh water. For the people who lived in the city even, they shared a well or water coming in from an aqueduct. And they'd all have to go out and get their water and bring it back to their homes. The sisters were fortunate enough to have their own well, and as it turns out, water formed a major part of their diet because they were dependent on people donating food to them, and it was the friars who would go out and beg. But if we look at this courtyard, it's sunny. This is where the sisters would have spent a good part of every day, unless it was particularly cold. They would have stayed there. They would have been doing their handiwork. They would have been doing the various kinds of peeling vegetables and during periods of recreation, chatting and talking together. Yes, they would have been sewing. Clare sewed, wove, and spun. She learned all of these skills in her family home.
And presumably many of the other ladies who had joined her had similar skills, would they not have?
Well, yes.
Agnes would have, and so would, to
Well,
what extent Pacifica would have had the same skills, and
yes, I think all of the women were
Benvenuta.
trained, right? Benvenuta joined them. Pacifica joined Clare and Agnes within a few weeks after they moved to San Damiano. Benvenuta said she came the following September.
Right. So we're talking between March and September, and now we know there are at least four,
And there more
and there
likely were
probably
more,
were a few more besides.
but we know of these because they were still living when Clare died.
Mm-hmm.
There may have been others who died before Clare's death.
Mm-hmm.
Directly off of the courtyard, walking through that arcade which you saw, you will come into the refectory, that is the dining room, where the sisters sat and had their meals when they had enough food.
Mm-hmm. Which was not really all that often, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes.
Mm-hmm.
But the diet was extremely sparse.
Yes, the friars would beg for them, but the people in the town at first were not very happy about this development.
Mm-hmm.
They looked at these pampered rich girls who were going off to live where they expected the townspeople to provide for them. One of the things that struck me about the refectory was its arched roof, which gave it a sort of picture of or feel of being a church. And meals were holy times. We think of the Eucharist, and I'm sure Clare did. We will eventually tell many accounts of events that happened in this refectory. But this still is retained as it was in Clare's time. And in the far corner, if you can squint your eyes a little bit, you should be able to see a little bouquet of flowers, which the friars keep at the place where they think Clare probably sat when she was with the sisters in the refectory. The only other part of the ancient monastery that's available to visitors is what was once the infirmary, a small room above the refectory, which is now fixed up as a lovely little prayer chapel. And I know that I found that a wonderful place to go, largely because very few of the people who visited and walked through San Damiano, chattering and talking and so forth, knew about this little prayer room. And so those of us who did could go up there and pray quietly and not be disturbed by the crowds, literally, who were going through the church and the monastery of San Damiano.
The brothers, as the sisterhood began to really form and began to be more than just a few companions, the sisters became really a sisterhood, and as they did, right from the start, the brothers, the friars, Francis and his friars, were extremely solicitous and made it their great responsibility to provide for the needs of the poor ladies. And so a portion of their begging through the countryside would always go to San Damiano, to the sisters. They were very solicitous about gaining whatever they could acquire, assemble, whatever in the way of wood, in the way of artifacts, to make the barrenness, the emptiness of what was San Damiano when Clare and Agnes and Pacifica first moved in, to be more a little bit like home. They got wood for the choir stalls. They got wood for the tables that they used in the refectory. They got other kind, probably some kind of closets and wardrobes or whatever, anything to store storage cabinets of whatever kind. But the brothers made it their prime responsibility to take care of the sisters. And Francis especially looked at their vowed obedience and their voluntary embrace of total poverty and was extremely sensitive to their needs. And at one point, when he was questioned about his concern for them, he replied very seriously to those who were questioning him, saying, quote, "Not to have called them would not have been a wrong, but not to care for them now that they have been called would be the greatest of unkindnesses." So their life was far from easy. Their share of privation, of poverty, hardship, toil, humility, and the contempt of the world around them.
Yes.
Because, as Karen said, the citizenry, by and large, of Assisi was not all that favorably disposed to this small group of wealthy girls who had decided to abandon all of the comforts of their station and now rely on alms from the poor and the middle class and the working people themselves. And so there was somewhat the attitude from at least some portions of the town that was, well, if they want to embrace poverty, fine. Well for them, let them experience it. And so the life of the sisters initially, and not just initially, but throughout their time, was a difficult life. A life that was very stark, very poor, and which probably very effectively managed to weed out those who were not deeply, deeply spiritually called to embrace poverty in the figure of, in terms of a relationship with the poor Christ, a living, loving relationship that would animate their lives and give meaning to their lives and lift the drudgery and the privation and the hardship of poverty into something sublime, something miraculous, and above all, something joyful.
Yes.
Something joyful. The joy of Clare's life is what Francis remarked on so often, and what was so noticeable and so keenly seen by many, many others, popes, cardinals, clerics of all stations, townspeople, whatever. All of these people saw in Clare and her sisters women who were truly, truly joyful and at peace with their life, content in their abject and absolute poverty.
Since we're talking about the early days,
Mm-hmm.
and we gave a picture of the environment in which the sisters began this grand experiment, I should also like to give a little picture of the personality of the woman,
Mm-hmm.
Clare, as I could make it out from the way it was depicted by the sisters who lived with her and by her first biographer, who also knew her. I found in reading about her a picture of a woman who was lively, loving, joyful, as Paul says, tender, very caring for her sisters and for the sick and the poor that soon began to stream towards San Damiano. She did have a tendency to go to extremes, especially in fasting and penitential practices.
Mm-hmm.
This was a passionate woman, and she was determined. She was stubborn, if you want to put it in another way.
Mm-hmm.
but it made it possible for her to gain what she most wanted by the end of her life.
I think that determination, that kind of steely determination and single-mindedness, that purity of heart that we talked about when we discussed the Beatitudes, that single-minded vision that she had uh, was offset, so to speak, and made palatable, if you want, because she had to, for all of the historians and commentators and the sisters, she had such a sweet disposition. She was so self-effacing. She'd never stood on her own importance or anything like that. She was always a very affable, very congenial, very sweet and solicitous woman.
Well, she regarded herself as a servant of the sisters. She never accepted the title or the role of abbess of the community. And Francis, what she wanted most and begged Francis to give her was his concern. He was the superior of her house, and it was to him that she had pledged her
Mm-hmm.
obedience. And she wanted that close relationship between the sisters and the brothers to exist always. And she wrote this in her rule. Francis faithfully kept this promise, which was to
Mm-hmm.
look after them, and wanted it always to be kept by the friars. She was a very prayerful woman. She would spend hours in prayer after the other sisters had gone to bed.
Mm-hmm.
And they said in the daytime when she would come to them, there was a sweetness about her, that a sweetness that came from her lips, while her face shone more than usual. Well, here you find a woman who's glowing
Mm-hmm.
with happiness.
Mm-hmm.
She's doing what she most loves to do.
Mm-hmm.
That her words were of an indescribable gentleness, is the way another one of her sisters described her.
Mm-hmm.
And Celano, her first biographer, said this of her: when she returned with joy from holy prayer, she brought with her burning words from the fire of the altar of her Lord, with which she enkindled the hearts of her sisters. So she made the hardships that they were bearing bearable by her own belief in it and in the
Her own
value of it.
ardor, her own passion,
Yes,
is kindled the fire in her sisters, her companions.
yes.
Mm-hmm.
What began as a wild experiment grew swiftly. Many of the sisters who joined her were girls she'd grown up with in Perugia
Mm-hmm.
and in Assisi. And they flocked to her, just like men were flocking to Francis.
Mm-hmm.
So what we are going to do now is to share a song with you that was written by a poor Clare, a daughter of Clare herself, Sister Briege O'Hare, an Irish nun. It is based on Ephesians chapter 1 and is called the Blessing Song. It is an expression of what Clare would have thought and prayed. It is sung by Sister Marie Cox, who I believe is a Sister of Mercy. And we will have the words in front of you so that when you start the music, you will be able to read the words.
May the God of our Lord Jesus Christ give you the wisdom to know what is revealed is true, for Jesus is risen. Oh, what riches He's promised us, how great is His power in us. We know that God's power is true, for Jesus is risen. We've been chosen by God before the world was made to live in holiness and know God's presence. Now at last, God has revealed His hidden plan for us, that we should all be one in Jesus' Son. Oh, what riches He's promised us, how great is His power in us. We know that God's power is true, for Jesus is risen. Oh, what riches He's promised us, how great is His power in us. We know that God's power is true, for Jesus is risen. We know that God's power is true, for Jesus is risen.
Karen,
Mm-hmm.
would you have some suggestions for our folks for the coming week based on what we've done today? Or is there a question or two that we could reflect on as we move into the week?
Well, I've often thought that we have to listen to what we hear in our own heart. And we have to realize that what the people say outside of us is not to be our guiding light. So I think one of the questions, when you see Clare being both determined and stubborn to follow her own way that she believes is God's call, that you listen to your heart and ask yourself, am I content with my life now as it is?
Mhm.
If not, what would I change? Do I have too much? Do I have more than I need? Is there a way to share with others
Mhm.
that could be a way of freeing myself up to be able to, as Clare did, walk joyfully in the footsteps of the poor Jesus?
Good questions for us for the coming week. We leave you this evening again by asking God's blessing on you in the words of Clare herself. May the Lord bless you and keep you.
May He show His face to you and be merciful to you.
May the Lord turn His countenance to you and give you peace.
May the Lord be with you always.
And wherever you are, may you be with Him always. We want to take this opportunity once again to thank you all for being with us this evening and to say how grateful we are for this opportunity to share the life and the times of Clare of Assisi with you. If any of you are moved to and want to know more about this, Clare's the book on Clare that Karen has written and published in 1984 is basically what we're using as a template to retell her story. The title is Clare, Her Light, and Her Song, and it can be obtained by contacting us at ravensbreadministries.com. If you go to the book page, you'll find it listed there, and you can either order it there or you can send us an email and we'll be happy to send you an autographed copy. Until next week, we bid you good night and God bless you. Thank you for being with us this evening.
God be with you.